Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. In this unprecedented time, we hope that you are all safe and healthy, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here with us today. My name is Jennifer Sterling, and I'm an instructional designer at the CE Shop, the leading provider of online real estate education. Today, we are going to review the key terms and memory hooks that you'll likely use for your real estate licensing exam. Sandesh Bilgi comes to us with over 20 years in the real estate industry, as well as many years as a real estate instructor and a motivational speaker. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Sandesh to get started.
Thank you very much. I am super excited to be here. As mentioned, my name's Sandesh, and I've been in the real estate industry for quite some time. But what I really remember is when I was sitting in the same shoes that you were wearing, because I was also at a point in my life where I was thinking, how do I pass this real estate exam? What are some of the memory hooks? What are some of the key terms? What are some of the strategies to better prepare to put me in a position where I feel comfortable and confident? And so what we're going to be able to do today is talk to you about the key terms and memory hooks on how to pass your real estate exam. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, and we'll be able to answer some of your questions. And we're also going to provide you with some additional resources. So very excited and ready to go. Now, I don't want you to get too overwhelmed by what you see on the screen. We're supposed to make this easier for you. But it's important to understand where should you be concentrating your efforts, but more importantly, your time. So if you take a look at this, what you'll see is that there's about 17% of your exam, which will be on contracts. Another 13% will be on real estate conceptual best practices, and then another 13% on agency. So oftentimes, as you're going through your training manuals, you want to determine what should you be focusing on. So just get an idea here of where you should be concentrating some of your time, what you feel confident in what you know, and where you think you might need just a little bit extra help or some time that you want to put towards that. So again, this is just an overall guide for all of you. Now, for years as a real estate instructor, people have often come to me and said, can you be my real estate translator? Because it's like a different language. And the truth is, it is. So every profession has its own lingo, just like real estate. And so we're going to share with you a little bit of that lingo, if you will, to help you better understand the things that you need to know. Well, the first thing is, if you've ever learned a new language, how do you do that? Well, first of all, you have to immerse yourself into it. You have to really experience that, understand your surroundings and the situations. You want to apply the key terms on a daily basis. If you're ever trying to learn a new word, try to get that word, understand the translation, the explanation, how is it used in a sentence? But then every day when you're in that same moment, try to use it as you engage and interact other people. And again, play teacher. And this is really true for real estate. There's no better way for you to truly understand the material if you're teaching other people. So those that are around you, your sphere of influence, which you're going to be meeting very soon and talking to them about being in real estate, start talking to them and helping them understand. Because if you can help someone else understand, then that clearly means that you understand it. Now, we often use acronyms. Many times we make them up, but sometimes they actually apply. But this is just a strategy to help you better understand what you're trying to learn. These are key words, okay? And this is going to be very helpful for you as you begin and start your career. But again, you want to remember that. Now, this is one that's on the screen that I remember ever since I was a child. My dad taught me this, and it's the knuckle method, right? When do we need to know this? When we're doing prorations. But if you remember, every knuckle is going to be 31 days. I still to this day can remember him teaching me this. I wonder how many of you were taught this when you were a child, and if you remember the knuckle method. But again, this will come in extremely handy when we're dealing with prorations, because again, that's the things that we have to figure out. What are some other things that we can use as far as acronyms? So look at this like we're playing Scrabble together, right? Here's your real life board game of terms and key terms and things that we're utilizing to better understand the material that we need to know. So again, you can kind of see some of the things that may already sound familiar to you. And some of this will be new, but that's why you're here, and we appreciate it. Now, the first thing we always have to make sure we understand from the basics are what are the 5 categories of real estate? Now, when you think about that, it could be really scary, right? So think about that. I'm learning a new language. How scary is this? Well, let's make it less scary for you. So take the acronym SCARY and realize that it stands for special purpose, commercial, agricultural, residential, and industrial. These are the 5 categories of real estate. And really the basic principles of this whole thing that we're trying to learn. So again, think about what we can do. So we can make it less scary for all of you. When we talk about ownership and we really understand the difference between land, real estate, and real property, people often get confused in what that means. Remember, the land is everything that you're standing on, but everything that goes up to the sky and everything that goes into the ground, down to the core of the earth. Okay. And we talk about real estate, that's any improvement on your land. But then when we talk about real property, that's your ownership rights. And how do we define our ownership rights? Basically with the bundle of rights, or we call them sticks, if you will. So think about the term deep sea. So you're going to go diving, you're going to go deep sea diving, and that's going to tell you everything that you know when it comes to ownership of real estate. Pretend you own the ocean. And what does deep sea stand for? It stands for disposition, exclusion, enjoyment, possession, and control. These bundle of rights are ultimately what the definition of real property is and how you as an individual can use your real property that encompasses real estate and land. So again, deep sea, we're going deep sea diving so that you understand your rights as an owner with real estate. Now, when we talk about the final walkthrough and we talk about the true conveyance of property, when you transfer the rights from one person to another, we always have to sit here and think about the difference between real property and personal property. If you remember, you may have been taught that one of the old ways that you could determine the difference between real property and personal property is if you could turn the house upside down, shake it, and whatever falls out will be personal property. Not quite exactly how that works in real life, right? So there are some legal tests to determine. And so for this, we're going to go to our good friend, Maria. So think about Maria, and she's going to be there with you as you take your test, reminding you that when you get to the questions of what's personal property, what's real property, just look over and be like, hey, Maria, I need some help, right? And so what Maria's going to help us out with is to tell us that it's about method of attachment. It's about the adaptation of real estate. Is it being used in a real estate manner? If you put a front door, you need to have a door. Now, a door can easily be removed, and you can buy a door from a hardware store. But once you affix it to the property, the use of it is exclusion, which we just learned about in deep sea, but that's being used in a real estate manner. That's what adaptation of real estate means. Relationship of the parties. All right. So again, how is that relationship of the parties put together? What was agreed upon and what's in the contract, which will come to the next A, which is agreement of parties. And then the I, as we mentioned, is going to be the intention. So the R, the I, and the A really deals with the buyer and the seller and what's been discussed. We know how important contracts are, and especially the language in the contracts. But Maria, thank you for your help. We appreciate you helping us identify the legal tests of a fixture. Now, people often ask, how much does it cost to own a home? And that kind of sounds like a silly question because you're going to say, well, it depends. What'd you pay for it? That's not what they mean. They mean, what are the actual costs of owning a home? And this is where we have to remember PITI, P-I-T-I. You know, you can often say, like, it's such a pity that you have to spend so much money on a house, right? When you think of it from that standpoint, again, we want to keep it positive, but it's a lot of money that you're spending. What does PITI stand for? That's going to be your principal, your interest, your taxes, and your insurance. So remember, PITI. PITI is the cost of owning a home. And that'll be an easy way for you to remember. Now, Fiduciary responsibilities. This is something that's so important. When you think about agency, you have to remember that there are responsibilities that you have as a real estate practitioner towards your client. And this is called fiduciary. You may have never heard this word before, but now as a licensed practitioner, you're going to understand that you have some responsibilities that are more than the average consumer and more than your interest in real estate that you had prior to getting a license. And one way to remember this is that when you get in your car, you're going to be cruising down the street, going to your first real estate appointment. You're going to have the windows down. You might even have the top down, and you're going to be in this old car. Like, just remember, like this sweet car that everyone's looking at you, and you got this confidence because you're like, I got my real estate license. I'm going to my first appointment. How cool am I? Right? So old car. Remember the old car that you're driving when you're going to your real estate appointment to meet your clients, because these are your fiduciary responsibilities. Obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, and reasonable care. Obedience, again, as we know, is that you have a responsibility to abide by your client's well wishes and what they want to do, provided that it's within the framework of the law, of course. Loyalty. Loyalty doesn't mean what you think loyalty means in this particular case. What loyalty means is that you are not going to put your own needs above your client. You're not going to sit here and think what's best for my client, because it's not about what you think. It's about your client. So always remember that. Disclosure, I think we know that. We have responsibilities on what we have to disclose. Confidentiality, again, we cannot release, disclose any information that could deem harmful to your client's negotiating position. Accounting, right? We want to remember that funds need to go into a separate account. That's a business account. Otherwise, we have what's called commingling. And if we actually use that money, it's called conversion. We don't like those words at all. We want to make sure that we understand that. And then reasonable care. And really what that means is that now that you're a licensed real estate practitioner, that you are abiding by the rules and the regulations and the ethics and the codes and the expectations of what that means, right? There's a higher responsibility. So get ready to cruise down the street in your old car, going on your appointment, and that's going to be so cool, and I can't wait for that. Now, switching gears to something that's not as exciting, but we have to talk about antitrust violations. These are really important. And what you need to understand with antitrust, this is not just for real estate. This is for anyone when it comes to business. And we have to make sure we abide by these rules. And the one thing to remember is the T gap. And it's just something that we can use to kind of remember and say, what's the T gap, right? If you think of like a T intersection almost, is when you get to that, you have to make a decision, right or left. And in this particular case, when we hit that T, we want to go the right way and not the wrong way. And that would be a violation of antitrust. So the antitrust violations are a tie-in agreement where you predicate one agreement on another. They have to be separate. Group boycotting is when you're working with other brokerages or brokers trying to ultimately blacklist someone in the community. And that means that you're ultimately not willing to work with them or have them not work with you. And that's something that you cannot do. Allocation of customers and or markets, and that's really territory. You can't decide where you want to work and tell someone where they can't work. This is not the same as niche marketing. You're allowed to work anywhere you want, right? Wherever you feel most comfortable and most competent. But someone can't tell you that you can't work within a certain area. And the last one that's, I don't want to say the most important because they really all are, but I would say the most prevalent is going to be price fixing. And that's when brokers and agents and they communicate with each other, sharing their fees and their commission structures. That's something that you don't want. You're an independent contractor and everyone has the right to be able to work independently of each other. So there's no standard. I hear that word a lot. What's the standard commission rate? That would be a violation of an antitrust. So remember, when you get to that T gap, go the right way, not the wrong way. Now, here's our good friend, Peter Pan. When we talk about the use of property, there's two ways that we can determine rules and regulations. One is from the government and what the public powers are. The other are private restrictions. So we're going to look at Pete. Pete's cool, right? Because he flies around and he can see what everyone's doing and he can say, hey, I'm representing the public here. Let me tell you how you can utilize property and what your rights are. And so the Pete we want to remember here is police powers, eminent domain, taxation, and a sheet. And remember, when we talk about a sheet, it's when the property will escheat to the county in which the property is located. So let's remember Pete next time we're trying to determine the public powers on governing real estate. Now, let's talk about encumbrances. We always talk about encumbrances and sometimes get really confused because there's so much that encompasses that. So let's talk about our friend Deli here. Deli is very well versed in encumbrances. She's done extensive research. So I want you to remember her when we get to the encumbrances. And let's think about what an encumbrance stands for. An encumbrance stands for a deed restriction. That would be a private restriction. Easements. And again, that's the privilege to use land of another. Liens, which we know has everything and only to do with money. That's a claim or charge against property. Licenses, and that's temporary use for a specific purpose. And encroachment, and that's when your real property, right? The real property and the real estate is located on someone else's land. So encumbrances encompass many things. And Deli reminds us that it's a deed restriction, easement, liens, licenses, and encroachments. So hopefully that's going to be a really good way for you to remember that Deli's here to help you because she's very giving and she wants to make sure that when you have your own real estate or when you're representing someone, that you're making sure that your client knows all of the things that could help or potentially impede the sale of their property. These are really, really important. Now, how are easements created? So that's a great question that you ask. Well, hold on tight, and I'm going to tell you. So what you want to do is you want to grip, right? And you're gripping. You know when you're driving that old car, and sometimes we call it white knuckling. But when you think about an easement, you're like, oh my God, I can't remember an easement, and you're gripping your hands really tight. So think about that when you're at your test. It's like, what am I remembering? Well, an easement's created by grant, by reservation, okay? And then the I we kind of throw in there to help you, but that's really based on prescription. And really there's another one in here, which is necessity, which could be called intent. And so that intent is that you can't be landlocked. So that's going to be an easement by necessity. So willing, reservation, intent, and then prescription. And that gives you your grip to make sure you understand what easements are. Water rights. Something simple, but one of those things that you're like, oh, I forgot to review that. So let's make that really easy. I don't have anything funny or cute here to tell you about water rights, but what I do have to tell you is R, riparian, and L, littoral. Think riparian, that R stands for rivers, streams, or small bodies of water. L, littoral, lakes, seas, oceans, bigger bodies of water. So that's really simple. Use the R for river, small bodies. Use the L for lake, large bodies. Now, the 4 unities of joint tenancy. We get really confused when we talk about co-ownership and the difference between tenant in common and joint tenancy. The thing you have to remember when it comes to joint tenancy is always think about the right of survivorship. All right, that's really important. You want to write that down, right of survivorship. But when you look at Pitt, right, look at this face. This is just a gorgeous face. You can never forget this face. Think of the Pit, right? Your pit bull. Beautiful animal. So you have to have Pit in order to have joint tenancy. And what Pit stands for is possession, interest, title, and time. That means all the co-owners have to possess the property. They have to, meaning they all have to own it together. They have to have equal interest. That's a key word, equal interest. They have to all be on title. And then this has to be done at the same time. So you can't add someone later onto that title in order for it to be considered a joint tenancy, opposed to a tenant in common. Those are independent interests within property. So that's the big difference. And I mentioned again, right of survivorship. So thank you to this handsome fellow. Our pit bull is going to remind us of joint tenancy. Legal descriptions and measurements. Listen, I wish I had the most creative thing to tell you when it comes to legal descriptions, but sometimes there's just going to be memorization. That's just it. You're going to have to remember this stuff. And so whatever the best way is for you to do that. 43560. I'll tell you something that I used. And again, I'm dating myself right now, going back almost 20 years. But what I remembered is when I was looking at this, somehow the numbers just popped out at me. And I looked at the 4 and the 3 and I added them up and that was a 7. I looked at the 5 and the 6 and I added that up and that was 11. And then I remembered 7-Eleven is always open. So the 0 is for the O. 7-Eleven always open. What a great way to remember 43560 square feet in an acre. And then again, 5,280 feet in a mile. Again, nothing creative, but I just did the 7 again. 5 plus 2, 8, 5, 8, or 7 and 8. And then again, just that's where you can only do so much for memory, but that could be helpful to get their mind flowing in the right direction. And then just remember 640 acres in this section. That's just, once you understand that, you're going to get these questions correct because that's a really important number to understand. So those are your legal descriptions. Pay attention to them. Make sure you understand them. Make sure you know them. All right, transfer tax. Depending on where you live, right, that transfer tax is going to be very different. But again, we don't like transfer tax. Just like if I was going on a hike and I ran into this, no bueno. I would be turning around and running away, which is often how we feel when we get our closing statements on transfer tax. So SPAT, not a very nice thing, but again, that's just a way to remember this. What does SPAT stand for? Sales price. So make sure you take your sales price minus any personal property, minus any assumable mortgage, if there is any, and then that's your taxable amount. Okay. And make sure, again, you understand that depending on what state you're in is you want to determine when you have to round up. And that's what you're going to determine when you apply your tax in your state and your county, and you want to put all that together. So pay particular attention on what the deductions are, because again, that could confuse you. And the most important thing here is it's sales price. You're paying tax on what you purchase. Okay. And the reason you deduct assumable mortgage is because if there is an assumable mortgage, the taxes were already paid on that initially. And so you're not going to get double taxed on that. How nice of the government, right? All right. I get this question all the time. I don't get a valid contract. What does that mean? Well, make it simple. A valid contract, just remember cloak, put on your cape. Okay. You're the superhero. You put that cape on and you can get from point A to B, because that's the validity of where we're at. That's a valid contract. So let's go over these terms. Consideration. Okay. Anything of value. It's not just money. It's anything of value. Legally competent parties. Offer, acceptance, and you have to have consent. Okay. And again, when we think about consent, we have to have that capacity to contract, but it's got to have that legal purpose. And that's what consent means. You cannot enter into a contract for illegal reasons, in which that would be a void contract. Now, I want to try and repeat this a couple times so that we understand. When you have a valid contract, it can be oral and it can be written. So signature is not a requirement. That's what really confuses people. Validity is different than enforceability. Based on the statute of frauds, all contracts must be in writing to be enforceable in court. But still, without that, you can still have a valid contract. And again, all you need is a cloak. Consideration, legally competent parties, offer acceptance, and then consent. Okay? And so if you have these, you have a valid contract. If you're missing any one of these elements, you have a void contract. That's really how simple as it is. So let's not over confuse it. All right? But these guys look like they're having fun, and I wish I was doing that right now. People often ask us, how do you know when you actually own something? Well, the thing you have to remember is, think of this person. Every time you buy a house, for some reason, when I was showing a lot of property, every time I would go, there's always a cat sitting on the front porch. And it's almost like cats know more about real estate than anyone else. So think about that cat that's going to be waiting for you when you go home. And that's how we can determine our proof of ownership. Certificate of title. abstract of a title, an attorney's opinion, and title insurance. These three things are what proves ownership. Remember, the deed is simply the document. So we don't show a deed to prove ownership. We have to have title that proves ownership. As this cat, it reminds us of what those proof of ownership items are. Now, we talk about fair housing, very important. And it's important that we understand what are the protected classes and really what we should be remembering. So check this out. Reckless realtors can never have financial success. There is so much truth to that. So much truth to that. Because if you're reckless, you could lose your license. So let's talk about federal fair housing. Reckless realtors can never have financial success. I want to have you repeat that. So we're going to say it together. Reckless realtors can never have financial success. And I'm saying this over and over for two reasons. One, so you understand federal fair housing. Two, so that we know that there are rules and regulations that we have to follow. So let's take a look at this. What are the Federal Fair Housing Act categories? These are the protected classes. And what this means is that we cannot discriminate on housing in real estate to anyone who is protected by race, religion, color, national origin, handicap, familial status, and sex. Really important that we understand these terms. So just take a moment and make sure you understand these, because this is, I keep saying, like, very important. Everything we talk about today is very important, but when it really comes to the way we operate, that it's critical that we understand that we are abiding by the actual laws and the governing bodies of what we do in the real estate world. So what creates value? So when you think about a property and you determine, how do I come up with its value? What is the worth of something? When we think about market value versus market price, what something's worth versus what someone's willing to pay for it. Think about dust, right? What a great way to remember something is like, oh my God, I want to have someone come take a look at my home. We got to clean before people get here. Get out the duster, get out the Swiffer, get out the vacuum, and we want to clean the house so it's spotless. Remove all the dust, because that's when our house is going to show at its finest to get maximum value out of our home, right? So what does that stand for? Demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. And so I'll have you kind of take a moment and take a look at this. So what does demand mean? Well, demand means that are there people that are interested in your property? And it's not necessarily your property, but it's in the community that you are residing. Are there buyers available? Are there more buyers available than there are properties for sale? We always talk about supply and demand, very important. Utility is the functionality. Does it fit zoning? Does it transfer correctly? Is there any reasons where there could be a delay in how things are being moved? So the utility is its current condition is probably the best way to summarize that. Scarcity is related to demand. And again, that talks about supply and demand. It's what's the inventory look like? And you're going to learn a lot about absorption rates and really focusing on how long does it take to sell all the properties that are available in the area that you're interested in. And then transferability. Are there any liens on the property? Are there any reasons why we cannot transfer this property to another homeowner? Will anything be held up during the closing process? So these are things that we want to obviously pay attention to. That's what creates value. So now that we've gone over majority of our memory hooks and key terms and things to remember, let's get down to the test itself. When you think of the exam, one, we want to make sure that we go in with confidence, right? Because I know, look, some of us have test anxiety, and that's expected. Many of us haven't been in a classroom in a while, but let's not look at it that way. The first thing you have to understand is they're multiple choice, and you're given the answer. So that should put you a little bit at ease. Now, all we got to do is pick the right answer, right? But you're going to have some experimental questions, and these are questions between 5 to 10. They're ungraded, so your timer won't continue. It'll stop. And the reason I mention these is because you might get to a question and you freak out because you're like, I didn't study that. I don't even remember that. Probably because you've never seen it before. And so when you get to that, that's where I'll remind you that this could be just a tester question. And they're experimental because every year they're trying to make modifications by adding new questions in. This might just be that one particular situation. So don't panic. Don't panic on that. Okay. Now, please don't go in thinking everyone's a tester question or everyone's a tester question, because then you're going to be like, wait a second, what's going on here? So just, again, pay attention to that. What you can also do is check your candidate guide, and you can kind of see how many questions, what the passing score is. And I think the most important thing that I advise everyone when they're going through this is you have the ability to go back and you can change your answers, and you can make sure that everything has been completed before you submit. But I will say this wholeheartedly, having worked with numbers, and I mean a number of candidates getting into the real estate industry across the country, unless you're 100% sure that the answer you're changing it to is the correct answer, I probably would go with your gut instinct on that, because you probably read it the correct way when you were initially going through it. And then what happens when you go back, you overanalyze, and then your mind starts playing tricks on you. I know you know what I'm talking about, right? So unless you're 100% sure, don't do that, because you're potentially eliminating a right answer and adding a wrong answer to that. That could be harmful to you, and I don't want to make sure that happens. So those are some things that I think hopefully will be helpful for all of you, and I appreciate you taking the time to learn more about this. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to some questions, and I believe that we do have some questions that people would like answers to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sandesh. Absolutely great. Really, really useful information. So thank you so much for that.
My pleasure.
As you said, we will take some time for some questions now. And yes, we do have a couple. So let's start with, we have a student wondering, how are you defining a niche market versus a specific allocation of market?
Yeah, that's a great question. Niche market or niche market, depending on where you're from, you might pronounce it a little bit differently, is an area that you want to prospect. It's an area where you live. It's an area where you want to market. It's a target real estate area that you want to ultimately convey property in. Where an allocation of market would be that someone is imposing guidelines and restrictions where you can or cannot sell real estate. So again, the key to this is where you have a choice versus where someone is telling you you can or cannot practice real estate.
Wonderful. Makes perfect sense. Thank you. We have another student asking, I always confuse race, color, and national origin. And can you give me some pointers in remembering the different?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think when we look and see how do we sort of from a demographic standpoint, there's elements where you self-describe where you're from, you know, from an ethnic standpoint, how do you identify? So that would be ethnicity. National origin ultimately means where you were born. You know, what is your origin of where you're from, I guess is what people often ask. And obviously when we look at color, you know, color again is, you know, color of our skin. And then when we get to race again, that's something that is you know, self-identified. And, you know, think about that when you're filling out your forms and you kind of get to that portion and say, we're race, how do you identify? That's probably the best word to use.
Great. Thank you, Sandesh. I know lots of people have trouble with that. We have another question. Any tips for remembering the acts and the years, specifically like 1974 marital status discrimination, et cetera, and others like that specific to the test?
Yeah, you know, I really wish I had a better answer for you for that. There really isn't anything that we have that's clever. But what I would do is when you go back and review those terms, look at the evolution of life and understand why those protected classes were added. And you can kind of think about the years of like what was happening during that time and maybe equate that to an action or a monumental occurrence, or like we always talk about, like in real estate, what's the best way to give directions? Look for a landmark of what you can utilize in your direction telling. So look at this from an evolutionary standpoint. There's a reason those protected classes were added because of something that happened during that time period. So kind of maybe Google something that happened in that time period, and that might help you remember, and it'll make sense as to why it was added.
Wonderful. Thank you. And it looks like we've just got one more, and this is a great one pertaining to test preparation. So specific to these key terms and memory hooks, do you suggest writing them down just before you start the exam as a memory jog, or do you have any other tips for sort of committing these things to memory?
That's actually a fantastic question. So I'm a national trainer, and one of the things that we pay attention to is adult learners. It's a different way of thinking and learning as it was, if you recall, depending how far back we have to go with some of us back in school. There's three different types of learners. There's the auditory learner, there's the visual learner, and there's the kinesthetic learner. The audio learner really understands by listening. They're big on podcasts. These are individuals who like to dictate, whether their phones, and then play it back so they can hear themselves, because that's how they hear. So if you're an auditory learner, you're actually learning right now because of the things that I'm telling you to do. You get it, you understand it. If you're a visual learner, then what's happening is you're looking at my PowerPoint presentation and you're reading what's on the screen, and those visual appearances is what helps you understand. You like to draw pictures. Conceptually, you're going to say, here's the buyer, here's the seller, and then you're going to put the house and you're going to draw arrows, and that's going to help you navigate and understand that. But if you're a kinesthetic learner, then what you're probably doing is flashcards, because you're actually writing things down. It's mind muscle memory. So there's not one style that's better than the other. It really depends on you and what your learning style is, because that's what's going to tell you the strategy that you need to go. Some people can open the book and read it and they're good. Some people have to turn it into a story. And then some people have to do flashcards, memory cards, things that will help them from a kinesthetic, because they have to actually write things down. So hopefully that's helpful for all of you, because we all have a different style in the way that we learn.
Absolutely. That's wonderful information, Sandesh. And something like viewing one of these webinars and taking notes during may help satisfy all three of those. So if you're here today, then you're winning that battle. It looks
Very
like
true.
It looks like we have covered all of those questions, Sandesh. So I'll open it up to you just for a last thought. Is there anything else you wanted to cover before we wrap up?
No, I think the big thing is thank you for being here today. This shows the commitment that you're taking to learn and to be better at what you do. I think the big thing is to really have confidence with that. And if you need any help on the screen here, you'll see how incredible the support staff is here to assist you and provide great value. And you've got the email address here, you've got the website, you've got the phone number, but these are some resources that I would definitely take advantage of. And I think the one thing that I always tell people is you need to incorporate a little bit of theater into everything you do, role play a little bit, talk to people, and engage other individuals, help people to ask you questions. And I think if you can do all of that, you're going to be put in a position. It really comes down to confidence. But the one thing I'll share with all of you before we leave is remember why. Remember why you're getting your license, whatever the reason is. Okay. It always starts with why. And that why should motivate you, knowing that you're about to embark on a new journey that could ultimately be the greatest thing that's ever happened to you. So we wish you the best of luck, and we're excited for all of you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you being here today. And I'd like to especially thank Sandesh for joining us today. As always, your knowledge, expertise, and willingness to share it with our student community is greatly appreciated. Thank you all again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.